Friends, boom, bada boom, Russians' walls were shaking. More than 200 drones attacked Russia. In Engels, a military airfield was attacked. Strategic bombers that attacked Ukraine were damaged, as well as warehouses with FAB, KB, and cruise missiles. Moreover, it's reported that Kh-555, Kh-101 for Tu-95 and Tu-160 were damaged. Kuban in Russia, the Kavkazskaya oil pumping station has been burning for almost 2 days after a drone attack. Hur successfully attacked Russian facilities in temporarily occupied Crimea. Air defense systems, naval vessels, and a helicopter were hit. 13 Russian radar stations were destroyed. And in Russia, they're reporting an attempt by the Ukrainian armed forces to break into the Belgorod region. What is known about this? We will discuss all of this with the well-known military analyst Roman Svytan. Roman Grigorievich, welcome.
Greetings. I wish everyone good health.
Dear audience, please like this video and in the comments write a few warm words in support of Ukraine. Roman Grigorievich, how many bombers were damaged? Because according to information, as I understand it, there were several bombers and one Il that delivered missiles. They write, in the morning, an Il-76 arrived at the base, likely delivering a new batch of Kh-101 missiles. And in Engels, there were 3 Tu-95 MS and 2 Tu-160s. What do you say?
Well, they were definitely damaged. The question is to what extent, because there was a large-scale attack and a drone attack, most likely by a missile, and that bada boom, since it was a bada boom, the fifth element that broke through the roof, if anyone remembers that movie, it was most likely one of our missiles. I don't even rule out the possibility of using a long-range Neptune in that direction, and naturally the detonation that occurred after the strike, the detonation of missiles. Bombs, small arms, which are carefully loaded into the planes, among other crucial things. The planes standing nearby were naturally and significantly damaged. They could not have been left completely undamaged. The question is, to what extent is the damage? I think within a few days, our intelligence, our general staff will confirm after retrieving information from satellites and images, decryption, that is means of objective control. And then we will rejoice once again. Maybe in the next stream, we will clearly confirm this with you.
Roman Grigorievich, so what could have been hit? So the bombers themselves, a warehouse with cruise missiles and a warehouse with aviation fuel. That is, these elements were the target of the Ukrainian armed forces, our missiles and our drones.
Any base for strategic bombers is, for understanding, a large city. Besides the airfield itself, its support involves a great number of infrastructure facilities of various levels, starting from underground fuel storage for tens of thousands of tons of aviation kerosene and ending with some of the same warehouses and SIs, which is especially important. These are special engineering services for missile preparation. And of course, warehouses for aviation bombs and missiles that these strategic bombers use. They are still far away, by the way. Few people talk about this. But south of Engels, a few tens of kilometers along the left bank of the Volga, there is another object, the so-called Saratov 63. This is a nuclear storage facility, or rather a storage facility for nuclear warheads for strategic and tactical aviation. That is serious reserves of the 12th GUMO, the 12th main directorate of the Ministry of Defense of the Russian Federation, specifically tactical nuclear weapons, are located there. Just a few tens of kilometers, and the mushroom cloud wouldn't be like the one over Engels. There would be a concrete mushroom cloud, and even Kazakhstan, the Kazakhs would have seen it. It's just a pity there are too many friends in Kazakhstan, so it's a shame to disappoint them with this, of course. But nevertheless, this is such a serious object which to cover, well, not just with missiles, but with drones, to level it completely, you'd need several squadrons of bombers for carpet bombing. But if you blow up this underground fuel storage, I repeat, tens of thousands of tons of aviation kerosene, which is used by strategic bombers. One bomber, the Tu-160, takes 3 railway tankers of this kerosene. More than 150 tons of aviation kerosene are loaded there, and the Tu-95 takes 1 railway tanker. Well, that's also a lot. Then there's a reason to strike there. Regarding the damage that can be inflicted on this entire infrastructure, it can be catastrophic for the Russians. By the way, we once gave our 2 aircraft to Engels, both Tu-160s, Tu-95s, and Tu-22s. Our Kh-55s, hundreds of missiles were given away by Kuchma back then. Kuchma was deeply involved in this particular situation at the very least. And now we will certainly try to finish off essentially our very own strategic bombers that were given to the Russians. Well, as for what exactly was hit, that will definitely become clear within a few days after the satellite images are deciphered.
Roman Igorevich, how many military personnel are usually stationed at such air bases, military airfields?
Well, the thing is, they perform different tasks and cover different areas. But at least the regiment should definitely be there. About 1,500 Russian military personnel should be involved in this process. 1,500 to 2,000.
Could we have eliminated enemy personnel with these strikes, Roman Igorevich?
Well, definitely 100%. The thing is, even the SIS, that's the Engineering and Technical Service, a special engineering service, naturally the security, the defense of the object itself, missile storage, missiles aren't stored like matches. There are certain mechanisms for climate control, right? Especially for this kind of missile. So, well, several dozens were probably definitely eliminated, and the remaining hundreds, well, they were certainly emptied by that strike. Believe me, the shockwave there was serious.
Roman Igorevich, indeed, right now the Kavkazskaya oil pumping station has been burning for almost a day after the drone attack, and everyone is discussing the long-range Neptune, right? A modified missile. Let's discuss this missile and the strikes on oil refineries, bases like the Kavkazskaya one, which has been burning for almost 2
days now. Well, Malyuk and Budanov's operations have become the operations of Ukraine's defense forces. Why? Because in such strikes, and the strike on Engels, naturally, Ukraine's security services, special operations forces were used. So that's at least, well, and probably the Navy, if Neptune was involved, because a coastal missile system, a launch pad at least, is used. Well, I think within a day it will be clear. Long Neptune, that's the same picture, meaning its launch comes from a coastal missile system. Naturally, special forces are involved in this. The main targets for this kind of missile are objects that need to be breached. For example, a 150 kilogram warhead, that's not 20 kilograms for a drone, or 50, whatever they carry. And a part that is a 150 kilogram warhead, it can reach and detonate, as we see now. Presumably, let's say for now, presumably they blew up a warehouse with missiles and aviation bombs in Engels. Well, naturally, the same warhead can work. Or extending all the way up to the critical pumping stations. This particular operation represents one of our most significant and primary tasks right now, a truly vital undertaking. God forbid that we should ever have to cease or stop this essential process, as the consequences would be dire. All these representatives of the Russian authorities are now obsessed with the idea of how to secure Russian hydrocarbons. So God forbid these strikes stop as they were stopped last year. If Malyuk and Budanov's operations hadn't been stopped last May, this year there would be nothing left to destroy. We would have simply burned everything out last year. Now it turns out they are trying to stop these strikes. The missile is very good. This is our basic Neptune missile, or rather the Neptune. This is the basic KH-35 missile. At one time, it was also produced at our base. Our engines for this missile, two-circuit turbojet engines, the missile was air-to-ship. This is its main task. That is, it's an anti-ship complex. The missile was then upgraded, modernized to the level of ground operation, and with a good engine, with additional fuel tanks, it can now travel more than 500 kilometers. That is, it reached at least 500 kilometers to Tuapse. I think it could have also worked on Engels, because they practically breached a closed warehouse. Well, these missiles are not lying on the street. That is, it's closed. If it was breached, then most likely a missile entered. But there's no confirmation yet. We won't confirm it either. This is an analytical note.
Roman Igorevich, just to clarify for our audience, what is the range of this missile and what opportunities are now opening up for us? So we can record this now.
Well, the missile's range, at least the confirmed one, is 500, 600 kilometers, that's for sure. We saw this with Tuapse and perhaps now with Engels, yes, if it's over 600 kilometers there. The declared ranges are 1,000 kilometers. What does 500, 600 kilometers mean? Well, it's a semicircle from Moscow through Engels to Tuapse. Just draw that circle. That's everything we can reliably hit with this missile. And the declared range is 1,000 kilometers. You can draw a circle up to St. Petersburg, for example, and a semicircle practically to the Caucasus. That is, it will already cover closer to Kazakhstan in the east, beyond the Volga, at least beyond Engels, beyond Astrakhan, closer to Kazakhstan. And in the south, it will reach the North Caucasus. This missile, if the declared range corresponds to the actual flight range. Technically, it's possible. By and large, the engine is very good. Our engine that we produce, it will work for an hour exactly, and the missile speed is 850 kilometers per hour. It's not a problem for it to work for an hour and a half. The main thing is the fuel. That is, how many extra buckets you fill into the missile, that's how far it will fly.
So Moscow, St. Petersburg military infrastructure facilities can be attacked?
Well, unequivocally, they are already under such a serious target. And in order for us to fully complete the task of ensuring the security of our border, we need to reach about 2,000 kilometers. Roughly speaking, we need to reach the Urals. From here to the Urals is 2,000 kilometers. But a cruise missile, it hardly makes sense, for example, to make cruise missiles of such a range now. Optimally, of course, either drones, they are a little cheaper, or ballistic missiles. Such a range, either solid propellant or liquid propellant, that is ballistic missiles. I think we will solve this issue. If not this year, then next year.
Roman Olegovich, there's also good news that the main intelligence directorate successfully attacked Russian targets in occupied Crimea. So air defense systems were hit, as were naval vessels and a helicopter. 13 Russian radar stations were hit, including one L-125, Nebo-SV, Nebo-SV, and BRL-S. How do you assess the work of the GUR? I understand that all of this was done within a certain period of time, and it has now been recorded.
Well, that's definitely over several months. This is the work of GUR's Bex Magura. The main intelligence directorate and the security service, their Bex practically made aircraft carriers out of unmanned boats. Both of them. Both the GUR's Magura and the SBU-C Baby. They can now carry and operate almost like an aircraft carrier, carrying unmanned aerial vehicles, and these UAVs can also carry surface and underwater drones, meaning they can act as a mothership and a repeater simultaneously. So a boat which is several meters long and a certain width can take on board, for example, unmanned aerial vehicles approach to the coast of Crimea or somewhere on Russian territory, perhaps closer to the significant port city of Novorossiysk. And then, just a few kilometers from the coastline, they could effectively launch their drones with direct and precise control, utilizing exactly the boat as a repeater. The guys can perform a combat mission just as they directly perform a combat mission, for example, with the same FPV drones. That is, a drone of a certain level, a UAV, takes off and then destroys the Russian radar system, destroys the anti-aircraft missile system, or some military object depending on its capabilities. Plus, especially the GUR's Magura can also carry sea-launched missiles. Air based on the launch. This is the R-73 air-to-air missile. It's an excellent missile, already half a century old. Thousands of them have been produced. We have these thousands. There's a thermal homing head. If you aim it, the missile locks on, it will catch the target. And if there are two missiles on the Maguras, that means it's also for destroying air targets. We have confirmation of a helicopter's destruction, and not just one. One was completely destroyed, and the second was seriously damaged. So the GUR operatives in this sense have practically become naval aviators, I would say. That is, the GUR has entered a sphere not typical for itself and has performed quite well there. And Malyuk Security Service, GUR under Budanov and SBU under Malyuk, they are practically using the entire spectrum of strike weapons now, and they are producing them at their own base, which is very important. These are special services at their own base, at their own expense. They have small budgets. They are not the armed forces of Ukraine. They don't have billions of dollars, but they are doing it at their own expense. They found sponsors, most likely, and they carried out such tasks. Well done. Nothing to say there.
Roman Igorovich, before we talk about the Belgorod region and information from Russian war correspondents, I would like you to give a brief educational overview of the Ukrainian Grom-2 missile system, what capabilities it has in perspective, and how these capabilities should be used. Please, the floor is yours.
Well, to understand what Grom-2 is, it's the same Iskander. In terms of range, warhead control system, we have the same Iskander. This was a particularly good and highly significant project, specifically named Sapsan, which was successfully launched several decades ago. Building upon the foundational work of this very Sapsan project, A robust and powerful solid propellant ballistic missile system was subsequently allocated for the formidable Groms. And naturally, this project yielded results, meaning work on this project. Grom 1, Grom 2 are now available. We made the 300-kilometer range version and sold it to the Saudis, along with the technical documentation, partly with Saudi money, by the way, but most likely the intervention of our partners allowed us to get back at least the technical documentation, maybe some launchers, and I wouldn't rule out some missiles as well. So what is Grom 2? It's the same Iskander, 500 kilometers. Moscow, Tuapse, that's 500 kilometers. So if there are enough ballistic missiles, then the Rubliovka escorts, remember we talked about this once, should move far from the bathhouses where key decisions for Russia's war are made. Why? Because, well, the first Grom, it will definitely bury Lenin. Pasha, how long will he lie there after all? The Kremlin is first and second is Rubliovka, or vice versa, depending on preference. Maybe Rubliovka will be first.
Roman Igorovich, now, of course, this information, which has been circulating for several days in Russian propaganda publics and among Russian war correspondents, because Russia is announcing an attempt by the armed forces of Ukraine to break into the Belgorod region. What is known about this? Let's analyze it.
Well, to understand the process, we have approximately 600 kilometers of border. Well, if not with curves, so to speak, but a straight border between Belarus and Oskol, that is between Ukraine and Russia. From our side, it's Chernihiv, Sumy, Kharkiv regions up to Oskol. From Russia's side, it's Bryansk, Kursk, and Belgorod regions. So for us, the main task is to turn this borderline into a front line because that's correct and smart. We need to change the architecture of the front, open a northern front. It's already open after we started moving into the Kursk direction towards Moscow, as it's called by the most agreeable idiots. Under the main task of pinning down the enemy, several tens of thousands of Russian soldiers were pinned down there. And naturally, the creation of a so-called security zone, a buffer zone, it's called differently, a support zone if it's a front line and a minefield. We need to create such a security zone about 30 kilometers deep into Russian territory, a demilitarized one, and the Russians denazify it by immediately bombing it with aviation bombs and artillery and evacuating the civilian population from there. So such a buffer zone is created by entering not even 30 kilometers. You can go 3, 5, 7 kilometers, but into Russian territory to mine, not our territory, but Russian territory. Lay several 100,000 of these mines, and they'll be digging them out for 100 years if they even want to. And naturally, army artillery, 25 kilometers, yes, will add to the 30-kilometer zone, creating such a buffer zone. In the Kursk direction, we made it. We accomplished it. The only retreat, as we already said, the flight was practically catastrophic because the decision to retreat and deploy into defensive positions was not made in time. What we are doing now in the Belgorod region is the same operation, only not deep, without an operational breakthrough, a tactical operation with entry and the creation of such a buffer zone on Belgorod territory, occupying the best defensive lines. The thing is, the difference in altitudes there, it's the so-called Central Russian upland. The difference in altitudes is 50 to 70 meters. And between, well, just for understanding, between the hills, right? That is rivers. If there are small rivers that are insignificant, they are somewhere at a height of 140 meters above sea level. And the top of these uplands is somewhere around 220 to 230. So these elevation changes, it's better to occupy them at heights, no matter where they are, on our side and on the Russian side. If there's an opportunity to enter Russian territory to improve defensive positions, that task is being carried out. Right now in the Dmitrivka area, a task is being performed in the Belgorod direction. Well, the first question, of course, is the creation of such a buffer zone. And the second question is to try to intercept Russian reserves that will now be freed up from the Kursk direction during our withdrawal along the borderline and will be transferred to the Eastern Front, so that they don't end up in the Pokrovsk direction. They have about 2 divisions there, maybe. That's practically 30,000 Russian Federalists that can now be transferred from the Kursk direction to the Eastern Front. They will pass right through, or rather along through the Belgorod region. And in order to intercept them, I think such pressure is now being created in the Belgorod region. There is positive momentum at the moment, at least. It's clear that we cannot discuss tactical issues, even if we knew them. Well, tactical information cannot be broadcast. But in reality, I think in a week we will report on the results of this tactical operation.
Russians reported the alleged downing of an F-16 over Sumy Oblast. The Air Force has already refuted this fake. And what Andriy Demchenko states is that Russians are storming the Sumy Oblast border on quad bikes. New Su aircraft are destroying their groups. What do you say, Roman Hryhorovich?
Well, they got scared by the information that came out a few days ago. There was a good video sequence of F-16s being used over Sumy. Naturally, Russian IPSO would act differently. They correctly, from the point of view of logic and actions, they worked correctly. Our CPD and CPSO also need to take a leaf from their book. They also need to take an example. After all, FSB and KGB agents have been engaged in these psychological special operations for 100 years. And they had to carry out such an IPSO because the appearance of F-16s practically at the line of combat contact really pressured the Russians. Combat missions were carried out at extremely low altitudes, most likely dropping some means of destruction below the radar horizon of Russian air defense. And naturally, no one could reach it. And this pressured the Russians in that direction. So naturally, they had to override this information, and they came up with another IPSO claiming they shot down an F-16. Believe me, no one shot anything down. Well, I have friends, a sufficient number of friends, who, if something had happened, would have shared the information. And I can confidently say no one shot anything down. Our guys are working along the entire line of combat contact on F-16s and Mirages. Well, they have already embarked on combat missions, on carrying out combat tasks in those directions where such an opportunity exists, based on the density of the enemy's air defense and based on our capabilities to cover these aircraft. Gods do. So you can fill in the blanks so I don't swear too much. This God's due, as former President Trump sees it, was entirely orchestrated by Vladimir Putin. Why? Well, to create certain pressure. On the Ukrainian side, it's the same IPSO, an information psychological special operation involving top state officials. This is a serious operation. Why? To give the opportunity to the Russian, mainly Russian population, and of course to Trump, to suppress Ukraine and paint a different picture of real events on Kursk land. We are holding the Kursk land. No one there is surrounded. We are holding. Yes, there was a retreat, indeed, a belated flight. If a month and a half ago, as we said, there had been a controlled withdrawal, it would have been to defensive lines. It was a flight, but still to defensive lines on Russian territory. The difference is what we discussed. The Sudza River, Kursk, well, along the Kursk region, the Pereplyuika River at 140 meters above sea level, nearby, south of these heights. The elevation is already 220 meters, so there's at least a 50, 70 meter elevation difference here. This is Kursk land, and our units that withdrew from the Sudza direction have positioned themselves on these heights. No one intends to withdraw further at the moment. Naturally, Russians need to be shown that they are surrounded, that everything is lost. Boss, the client is leaving, the cast is being removed, everything's falling apart, and so on. They are trying to cut off, but it's very far from encirclement. It's simply unrealistic because this ridge is along the borderline, and naturally, our troops are present on Kursk land. I don't think we will leave there. It's a good defensive line. The Russians trying to cut off our direction got stuck in the Bazovka area. Yes, this is Sumy Oblast, Sumy territory. It's only a few kilometers from the borderline, no more. They are trying to sneak through, cut off the supply to this grouping. But in the information flow to increase this pressure, Putin, let's say softly, threw God's due at Trump. And Trump is already mirroring what else can he do. He is now tied to Putin, to his non-participation in that adventure they started with Netanyahu in the Middle East. Strikes against Houthis started again in Gaza, Lebanon, Syria. Naturally, if the Russians have their weighty say there, it won't be easy for them. That's for sure. Most likely strikes against Iran are ahead in the Middle East, into which they dragged Trump. Now he has nowhere to go. The quagmire dragged him in. He is such a great Israeli-American or American-Israeli. Therefore, Russian oil refining facilities will burn, all at various levels and further, perhaps not with such intensity, and it will be presented a little differently. Not attacks, for example, by Ukraine's defense forces, but the work of local underground movements of various levels. I think that work, by the way, such work by our confidence, can be approximately as effective as the Ukrainian defense forces are now. Believe me, tens of millions of Ukrainians will certainly not stop fighting for their territory, sovereignty, and territorial integrity. and several million residents of Donetsk, Luhansk, and Crimea. You simply cannot turn them back.
Dear audience, please like this video and in the comments, write a few warm words in support of the armed forces of Ukraine. Write what you think about this situation in general. The well-known analyst Roman Svytan, Roman Grigorievich, I thank you and traditionally see you next week.
Goodbye.